learners. Welcome to another lecture in the NPTEL course on Victorian literature. Thus far, we have studied in great detail the historical, cultural, and economic contexts in Victorian England, specifically those aspects of that context which directly influence the writing, the conception, and the publication of Aurora Leigh. I also provided a brief biographical introduction to the kinds of intellectual ferment that Elizabeth Barrett Browning was undergoing as she ruminated and struggled to decide the content as well as the form that this verse epic would take. The challenges of how to write a work which would carry forward the poetic traditions of English literature, but also remain in tune with the changing reading preferences in Victorian England. The challenge specifically that Elizabeth Barrett Browning faced was how to create a poetic work which would be in tune with the changing preferences for realistic and prose writing that were in vogue in the middle of the 19th century. And after a lot of debate and discussion and looking through many sources and influences, she decided to write this verse novel, which would document the growth and development of the mind of a female poet. That work would be called Aurora Leigh, and it has become quite well regarded and is among the most beloved pieces of verse literature of the Victorian era. Having studied both biographical as well as the cultural contexts, it is now time to immerse ourselves in the words, ideas, and feelings of this very important poetic accomplishment. And we will do that by reading the opening words, lines, and stanzas of Aurora Leigh. We will spend most of this lecture and the next one in a deep immersion in the kinds of structures of feeling that Elizabeth Barrett Browning is creating very painstakingly. And reading these words will help us situate this work in the literary and cultural history of Victorian England, and will also help us understand exactly what was going on in this work. Subsequently, after these two lectures of deep immersion in the words, I will provide some summaries and interpretative comments on the poem itself. But first, I will spend a considerable amount of time with the words of the poet herself. That said, let us begin Aurora Leigh. And this is how Elizabeth Barrett Browning begins. Book 1. Of writing many books there is no end, and I who have written much in prose and verse for others' uses will write now for mine, will write my story for my better self, as when you paint your portrait for a friend who keeps it in a drawer and looks at it long after he has ceased to love you, just to hold together what he was and is. This is the first stanza, and it's worth thinking about the manner in which Elizabeth Barrett Browning justifies the need, the importance, and the value of this poetic work. The poet addresses immediately the fact that there are many books, and the number of books and the amount of books can feel endless. Therefore, it might be futile to add more to that ever-increasing, ever-deepening pile of books. And yet, despite such a reason, despite such a fear, the poet asserts that she has very good reasons for adding to that pile, because the reasons that the poet cites are of a personal as well as of a public nature. What are these reasons? The first reason is that she wants to write for herself. The self becomes important. It doesn't matter what other people are doing. It doesn't matter how many books there exist. What matters is that there is no book that can serve the need a book that can describe herself. That book does not exist. There may exist countless other books, but the existence of these countless other books does not justify and does not capture the need, it does not address the need that this book would address. So she writes that she will write for herself and for her use, not for the use of others, but for her use. The word use is important here because, as I have mentioned earlier, the idea of a public career, the idea of a woman making a living by involving herself with the public, that is, the world and the people outside the walls of her home. Right? That was still a relatively new idea, even in the fourth decade of the 19th century. Those of you who are familiar with the history of the English novel know that women had begun writing in the middle of the 18th century. The novel, as it emerged in England, was also a feminine genre in the sense that a lot of women used that genre to enter the public sphere, to make public careers for themselves. And yet, it also was associated with a great degree of dishonor and a sort of bad reputation. It was considered to be immoral and not the most respectable thing for a woman to do. So, when Elizabeth Barrett Browning declares that the strongest reason for the poet to write a book for herself is that there doesn't exist a book that serves her own use, she is referring to that history of women's careers and women making a living out of their writing, which would be circulated in a wider public world. But then immediately she makes a distinction between an impersonal, professional, and objective public world and another public world which involves personal relations with another person, not an unknown, impersonal public, not a world of strangers who would know simply the author by the name printed on the cover of a book, but a personal relation. Who is that? And what is that justification for writing this book? Browning's narrator states that her act of writing this story, that is, this long poem, her act of writing this for her better self, is like someone would paint a portrait of themselves and give it to a friend, right? So this is an interesting distinction being made here, and it's worth thinking about exactly what the poet is claiming. So the first claim that the poet makes is that she is going to write her story not just for herself, but for her better self. And what is this better self? Does this better self exist in a different space, or does it exist in a different time? Now, it seems that this better self exists in a different time. And I say that because of what the poet says in the last line of the stanza. It is not clear in the second or third line itself exactly who this better self is. As we read on, we learn more, and the narrator gives us more clues. What is that clue? It is as if we would paint our portrait for a friend. That part is clear. We draw how we look like, and we give that portrait to a friend who keeps it in a drawer and looks at it long after he has ceased to love us. That is, there is a relationship of intimacy, warmth, affection between ourselves and another person. At the time of that affection's existence, we create a portrait of ourselves and give it to our friend. But they don't look at it during that period or immediately. In fact, they look at it a long time after we draw and give that portrait. And during that long period, something has happened. The affection has disappeared. They no longer care for us as they used to or as they did at the time when we painted that portrait. But then, in that period of the absence of affection and perhaps the faint memory of a past affection, we're not sure of that. We only know that the affection which once existed has disappeared. And in the absence of that affection, our friend, the person to whom we have given the portrait, looks at that portrait. The portrait is of us, not of the friend. And then what happens? In the poet's words, our friend looks at it long after he has ceased to love you, and just to hold together what he was and is. So there is a further twist in the tale in the very last sentence. We would expect that the point of giving a portrait to a friend and the point of our friend having a portrait looking at us or resemblance of us long after the affection between us has ended is for them to remember us. But no, that's not what the poet is saying. The poet says the point of the portrait is for our friend to remember themselves, right? Now, this situation is clear. This is the analogy. But how does this analogy help us understand what Elizabeth Barrett Browning is doing? Who is the friend who has lost affection for the poet? Just as there is a relationship between the painter of the portrait and the friend who eventually loses their affection for the painter, there are two entities in the poet's image too. Who are these two entities? There is the self, that is the entity referred to by the words mine, my story, I, right? These are the words referring to one entity. And the second entity is my better self, right? So there is a self who is writing the story, but the intended audience or the ideal reader of the story is not a public, but rather another version of the self. This is identified as a better version of the self. And the hint that the poet gives us is that this better version might exist sometime in the future, right? And something might have happened between these two entities in the future. What is that? The better self might have lost the affection for the self who is writing. Or it might happen the other way. The self who is writing might have lost their affection for the future version of themselves. In other words, the poet is writing because she is aware that there will come a time in the future when she will not be a poet. Or even if she is a poet, she will not feel the way she currently feels about poetry. Right? In addition, it may also happen that the world no longer cares for this poet. There are multiple ways one can interpret this very complex constellation of images. Two images, but there are multiple moving parts in these two images. And Elizabeth Barrett Browning's justification for this book-length narrative in verse, 9 books of poetry, designed to tell the story of the growth of a female poet, has a very complex justification in the very beginning of the book. Right? She is anticipating a time when poetry will no longer have the kind of intellectual power or social reputation that it now does. And in a way, the act of writing this book is a way to anticipate and protect oneself from that future. So poetry as a way of future-proofing one's life and one's identity. Right, let us move on and see how the narrator describes her origins further. She describes, I, writing thus, am still what men call young. I have not so far left the coasts of life to travel inland that I cannot hear that murmur of the outer infinite, which unweaned babies smile at in their sleep when wondered at for smiling not so far. But still I catch my mother at her post, beside the nursery door, with finger up. Hush, hush, here's too much noise. while her sweet eyes leap forward, taking part against her word in the child's riot. Still I sit and feel my father's slow hand, when she had left us both, stroke out my childish curls across his knee, and hear Asunta's daily jest. She knew he liked it better than a better jest. Inquire how many golden scudi went to make such ringlets. O my father's hand, stroke heavily, heavily the poor hair down. Draw, press the child's head closer to thy knee. I'm still too young to sit alone. So, what these lines are now doing is that they are giving us more detail, more specificity about these two selves, the self who's doing the writing and the ideal or implied audience for that act of writing, which is the better self, which is the better version or a future version of that self. What are these two? The first self, the self that is doing the writing, is creating a very elaborate but also very specific metaphor. It's the metaphor of travel, of a journey inland from the coast. Right? So there is a stretch of land which borders a water body, like perhaps a sea, which is signaled by the words infinite. And the poet is moving from that space of land bordering the sea to an inland space, a space that is a bit far away from the sea, from where the sound of the sea is heard, but its presence is not registered as intensely. Right? So, and what is the point of that image? What does that image allow the poet to establish? It establishes something about the age of the poet. Right? She has not so far left the coasts of life. Right? She has left the coasts of life, but not to such a great extent that she cannot hear the murmur of the outer infinite. It means that the memory of childhood is faint, but it has not yet disappeared. Right? And then we hear more about that childhood. The key detail of that childhood is that the poet lost her mother very early, and she remembers her mother outside the nursery door, trying to keep the room and its surroundings quiet in order to ensure that the child or the baby is not woken. This image is very strongly registered. And then there is another image which is a sort of indifferent presence, that of the father. The father's presence is less involved and somewhat uncertain, somewhat confused, but no less strongly registered and remembered with a great deal of feeling and a great deal of affection. Right? The father's slow hand is what the poet remembers, and it's the feel of this hand on the childish curls. Right? In addition, there is also the father's knee. Right? So we can see that there's a great difference from what the mother's presence meant for the poet, a kind of nurturing presence, a very deeply caring and immediate presence with her finger up and trying to keep quiet. And the father's presence is somewhat confused, somewhat unsure, and this uncertainty and confusion is signaled by the words heavily stroked fingers, stroking his childish curls, etc. Right? Now, the point of this is that the poet transports us to that time in her youth when she was very young. And despite her youth, the poet would like us to register the intensity and the feeling with which she registered these experiences. Let us read further. The poet writes, I write. My mother was a Florentine, whose rare blue eyes were shut from seeing me when scarcely I was 4 years old, my life a poor spark snatched up from a failing lamp, which went out therefore. She was weak and frail. She could not bear the joy of giving life. The mother's rapture slew her. If her kiss had left a longer weight upon my lips, it might have steadied the uneasy breath and reconciled and fraternized my soul with the new order. As it was, indeed, I felt a mother want about the world, and still went seeking, like a bleating lamb left out at night, in shutting up the fold, as restless as a nest deserted bird, grown chill through something being away, though what it knows not. I, Aurora Leigh, was born to make my father sadder, and myself not overjoyous truly. Women know the way to rear up children, to be just. They know a simple, merry, tender knack of tying sashes, fitting baby shoes, and stringing pretty words that make no sense, and kissing full sense into empty words, which things are corals to cut life upon, although such tries. Children learn by such love's holy earnest in a pretty play, and get not over early solemnized, but seeing as in a rose bush, love's divine which burns and hurts not a single bloom, become aware and unafraid of love. Such good do mothers. Fathers love as well, mine did, I know, but still with heavier brains, and wills more consciously responsible, and not as wisely, since less foolishly. So mothers have God's license to be missed. Right? Now, in this long section, several things established. The first words, I write, are followed by a period. These words establish very clearly the priority between the two selves that the poet introduced, the writing self and the ideal reader for whom the writing is being done. The writing self is in control here, and it is the intellectual labor of the writing self that establishes these very specific memories and very finely remembered details of the poet's childhood. The key things that the poet establishes and a clear division between the kinds of responsibilities, the kinds of values, and the kinds of things that the two parents could accomplish together. And the poet here makes a very clear distinction between the kinds of duties and things that a mother can provide and the kinds of duties and responsibilities that fathers could provide in their turn. This distinction and this difference flies in the face of much contemporary 20th and 21st century feminist theory and criticism. And this is also a hint as to the extent to which this poem and Elizabeth Barrett Browning's work can and would be appropriated by feminist scholarship. There is a great deal of difficulty in doing that, in aligning the values that this poem establishes with the claims and the ideas of feminist scholarship. Many scholars have struggled to reconcile some of these ideas, as is evident in this kind of value judgment being made about the kind of caregiving duties that men and women can provide to children, and the more revised and reformed views about caregiving that we are likely to hold today. And the scholarly consensus is that the work of Elizabeth Barrett Browning, while it does a great deal to help recognize the writing of women and give recognition to the struggles and the challenges and the ambition of a female writer, the ideal perspective that this poem creates, the perspective on Victorian literature and culture, from which this poem represents all the diverse aspects of Victorian society, is not ultimately that of a woman, but ultimately that of a Victorian sage. The Victorian male writer, the Victorian sage or the man of letters, the kind of writing that was being done by people like Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, Matthew Arnold, John Stuart Mill, and others. The kind of writing that I spent a great deal of time in my first two lectures. So this is a poem that is inspired by ambitious, scholarly, non-fictional prose writing by men. And a lot of times the feminist credentials that one might expect to be reflected from a work of this kind are just not there. So it is not that as a poet, Elizabeth Barrett Browning was less sympathetic to the women's cause, but rather it is the choice that the narrator makes in deciding to create a perspective. And the perspective that the narrator chooses is that of the Victorian sage who surveys every aspect of Victorian society and not merely that of a woman. Right? We will understand this and other aspects of this poem by continuing to read further in the next lecture.